Chapter 9. All eyes turned towards her. There was a moment of silence in the room as those present considered her suggestion. Then the king answered brusquely, "You will not. It's out of the question." Colour rose in Cassandra's cheeks as she spoke. Controlling her anger with a great effort, she spoke very calmly. "Why? Why should it be out of the question? Our family, our country, owes a debt of honour to Erak. The Scandians are our allies because of him. So why shouldn't I be the one to negotiate his release?" "Because," the king hesitated and she cut him off. "You've said that the task requires a seal-bearer, a member of the royal family. Well, I don't see any others around here. Why shouldn't I go in your place?" She paused, then added with greater intensity, "Dad, this is exactly what we were discussing a few weeks ago. One day I'll be queen. If I don't start taking on some of those duties now, I'll never be ready to be a real queen. Someone you'd be proud of."
"Cassandra, you will not go, and that's the end of it. Now, let's stop this discussion. It's embarrassing."
She sensed the weakness in his argument and knew what was behind it. "It's only embarrassing because you know you're wrong about this. I owe Erak my life. I have a right to help rescue him." There was a matching flare of anger in the king's face now, and she sensed that she had scored a point. There was no rational reason why she shouldn't undertake the mission. His objection to it was purely personal. It was understandable, she realized, but it was wrong.
"The problem is, Cassandra," he said, also working to keep his voice calm, "you're—"
"A girl," she interrupted. He shook his head doggedly.
"That wasn't what I was going to say. I was going to say you're inexperienced and young. You've never carried out negotiations like this."
"I negotiated the Scandian Treaty," she shot back, and he shook his head like a clumsy bear frustrated by a small dog nipping at its heels.
"You had Holt to advise you then," he said,
and she answered immediately, giving him no respite, knowing she had to press her advantage if she were to have any chance of winning this argument. "He can advise me on this," she said. She looked at the ranger. "Holt, you'd come with me, wouldn't you?" "Of course I would, Your Highness," he said. Unlike the king, he saw no good reason why Cassandra should not go on the mission. In Scandia, she had proved to be brave and resourceful, and she was no shrinking violet. She'd shown that in the battle line against the Temujai, when she had continued calmly directing her group of archers while the fierce horse soldiers overran her position. He had no doubt that she could look after herself.
"Halt,"
the king began, looking angrily at his old friend. But Lord Anthony now interjected as well.
"Actually, Your Majesty, there is a certain merit in the idea. The Aridi are a matriarchal society. Succession is through the mother's line. So they have no objection to dealing with women, unlike some countries. That makes the princess an excellent choice as your representative."
The king came to his feet abruptly. The heavy, high-backed chair he had been sitting in teetered for a moment on its back legs with the force of his movement. Then it crashed back onto a level footing again.
"I will thank you all to stay out of this," he said in an overloud voice. "This is a family matter. It is between my daughter and myself, and it is of no concern to any of you. Is that absolutely clear?"
The last 4 words were delivered in a shout, and there was an awkward silence in the room for several seconds. Then Baron Arald spoke.
"No, Your Majesty, I think you're wrong," he said firmly.
The king's furious gaze swung to him. Arald met it unflinchingly.
"Baron Arald, this does not concern you. Do you understand?"
Arald shook his head.
No, sir, I don't. On the contrary, it does concern me. It concerns all of us. I am the king, Baron Arald, and I say this matter is private.
Will watched Baron Arald with some awe. He had seen the burly knight's courage in battle several times, but this was something different. This was a far greater form of courage, the moral courage to speak out when your conscience told you to do so.
And those two statements contradict each other, Your Majesty. Because you are king, this matter cannot be private. Because what concerns you and your family concerns the country. In the past, you've said you valued my advice. Well, I don't value it now, the king snapped.
Arald shrugged.
If you only value my advice when I agree with you, you don't value it at all, he said bluntly.
The king flinched as if Arald had struck him. He realized that the other man was right, but still.
Arald, you don't understand. You don't have children. She's my daughter, and this will be a dangerous journey.
Cassandra snorted derisively, but Arald glanced quickly at her to silence her, then spread his hands in understanding.
Granted, Your Majesty, just as it was dangerous when you led the army against Morgarath, just as it was dangerous when Rodney and I fought the Kalkara. This is the price we pay for our privileged rank. We enjoy the privileges because when the time comes, we have to face the danger. And your daughter is no exception. She knew that when she and Will destroyed Morgarath's bridge and allowed themselves to be captured. The king was a relatively young man, but at the mention of that terrible time, his face seemed to grow haggard and old. That had been the worst time of his life, he thought. He sat down slowly. Arald softened his tone a little. Your Majesty, you're right. I have no children, so I can't fully understand how you feel. But your daughter is also right. She will be queen one day, and she wants to rule in the fashion you've set. There is a risk in all of this, but Cassandra is willing to take it, and so must you be.
King Duncan looked up and swept his gaze slowly around the room. Cassandra, he saw, was defiant as ever. Arald's face was set and determined. Holt and Crowley's faces were inscrutable in the shadows of their cowls. The two younger men were both a little wide-eyed, obviously uncomfortable at the emotions that had been bared in the room. There was still a hint of admiration in Will's eyes, however, as he continued to stare at the Baron. Rodney was nodding in agreement with Arald's statements, while Gillen made a show of studying his nails. Anthony's face was apologetic but determined. Alice was obviously trying to mask her feelings, but it was clear that she shared the boys' discomfort. Pauline alone was composed and calm. There was no sign of agreement in her expression. He sensed a possible ally.
Gentlemen, Cassandra, Alice, I wonder, would you mind giving me a few moments alone with Lady Pauline? He said.
There was a muttered acknowledgement of his request, and the 10 other people filed out of the room, leaving the king and the courier alone. As the door closed behind Will, the last to leave, Duncan turned to the tall woman sitting opposite.
What am I to do, Pauline? How can I talk sense into them? You have to help me with this.
He did his best to maintain a reasonable, non-argumentative tone.
Your Majesty, Pauline replied evenly, if this is why you asked me to remain, you might as well send me away with the others. I agree with Arald. You are wrong on this. But she's just a girl, he began. So is Alice, yet I've already sent her on several quite dangerous missions. Is your daughter any more valuable than my assistant? She's the crown princess, he said angrily, and Pauline raised an eyebrow. and as such she has a greater duty to the country than a mere orphan like Alice. The Baron is right. Those of us who enjoy great privilege have the greater duty, and Cassandra's privilege is second only to yours." Duncan stood and began to pace around the room. Pauline remained sitting, but she followed him with her eyes. "When you appointed me to a high position in the diplomatic service, did you hesitate because of my gender?" "Of course not," he replied. "You were the best person for the job." She nodded acknowledgement of the compliment. "You are the first ruler to accept women in positions of responsibility, without regard to the fact that they are women, and without worrying that your decisions might place them in danger from time to time." "I value ability above all else," he said, "man or woman." She spread her hands in a small, "there you have it" gesture. "Then value it in your daughter. She is an exceptional young woman. She's not one to sit simpering by the fire when the menfolk do all the dangerous work. She's proved that already. She's already done more, seen more, than most men will manage in their entire lives. The girl has a taste for adventure, and you won't break her of it. Personally, when I see the character and courage of the person who will succeed you, I thank the good Lord for it. You're a good king, Your Majesty, and she'll be a good queen, but you have to give her the chance." King Duncan's shoulders slumped as he realized she was right. He allowed himself a tired grin in her direction. He spread his hands in a gesture of surrender and returned to the high-backed chair. "What ever made me think you'd be on my side?" he asked her. Lady Pauline allowed herself a smile in return. "We're all on your side," she replied. "You were the only one out of step." She paused, then urged him gently. "Shall I call the others back in?" He nodded. "Why ask me? It's all of you who are making the decisions." The group filed back into the room, taking their former positions around the desk. They cast curious glances at Lady Pauline, trying to gauge what had passed while they'd been waiting in the anteroom outside. But the diplomat was skilled in hiding her feelings and gave them no hint as to what had been decided. Duncan sat, his elbows on the table, his head in his hands, while he marshalled his thoughts. When the usual shuffling and moving and settling into seats was done, he looked up at the group surrounding him. "Very well," he said at length. "I've decided. Cassandra will carry out the negotiations with the Arald." There was a quick intake of breath from his daughter, then she hurriedly rearranged her features, on the chance that he might change his mind. He glanced at her and nodded. Then he fixed his gaze straight in front of him again. "Holt, you'll go with her as her chief advisor. Help her in the negotiations and protect her." "Yes, sir," Holt said impassively. "Will, you'll go too, of course," the king said. "You've kept her safe before. Do it again." "Yes, sir," Will said, grinning broadly. He had assumed that he would accompany his mentor, but no one ever knew. Then it got even better. "Horace, just in case they can't manage it between them, you're going as Cassandra's personal bodyguard. Understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Horace said, and he and Will exchanged grins. Will mouthed the words, "like old times," and Horace nodded. Cassandra beamed at the two of them and moved a little closer to them. Off to one side, a frown touched Alice's face. "Right. Now, in addition to the three of you, I'll want to send a reasonable force as well. Say 20 armed men from the Royal Guard." The king paused as Holt raised a hand to interject. "Yes?" "Sir, we won't need them," he began, but the king interrupted him. This is not a matter of your ego, Holt. I'm not happy about sending my daughter on this mission in the first place, and I do insist you need an adequate force to protect her. You three aren't enough in my estimation. I agree, Your Majesty, but you're forgetting we'll have 30 fully armed Scandians with us as well. They're the best fighting men in the world. Horace couldn't help himself. He grunted in agreement, then hastily made a gesture of apology for interrupting. The king looked from Holt to Horace, then back to Holt again. You trust them? He asked bluntly, and Holt nodded. With my life, Your Majesty. Duncan fingered his chin thoughtfully. It's not your life I'm worried about. I'd trust them with my life too, Dad, Cassandra said calmly. Holt added further reassurance. I'll have Svengel swear a helmsman's oath that he and his men will protect her. Once they've done that, you'd have to kill all 30 of them before you even got near Cassandra. Duncan drummed his fingers, considering. Eventually, he gave in. All right, then, but I want to make sure. He looked keenly around the room. Gillen, you'll go too. Yes, sir, Gillen said eagerly. The prospect of a mission with Holt and Will was very appealing to him. But Crowley was frowning. That's highly unusual, Your Majesty, he objected. You know the old saying, one riot, one ranger. The saying stemmed from a legendary event in the past. A minor fief had risen up against their cruel and avaricious lord, with hundreds of people surrounding his manor house, threatening to burn it to the ground. The panicked nobleman's message for help was answered by the arrival of a single ranger. Aghast, the nobleman confronted the solitary cowled figure. They send one ranger? He said incredulously. One man? How many riots do you have? The ranger replied. On this occasion, however, Duncan was not inclined to be swayed by legend. I have a new saying, he replied. One daughter, 2 rangers. 2.5, Will corrected him. The king couldn't help smiling at the eager young face before him. Don't sell yourself short. 2 3/4.